In this podcast episode, Professor Ian Plimer shares his critical perspective on contemporary climate science and the global climate change movement. Drawing on decades of experience in geology and mining, Plimer discusses the scientific basis of climate change, the role of carbon dioxide, and the political and economic factors shaping the climate debate. He challenges prevailing narratives about human-caused global warming, explores the history of Earth's climate going back millions of years, and critiques the current policy responses and green technologies. Plimer also reflects on the politicization of science, the societal implications of the climate agenda, and the importance of adaptation over attempts to control climate change. Ian Plimer begins by recounting his lifelong passion for geology, from childhood visits to museums to academic achievements in Australia and Germany. He highlights his extensive field experience working underground in mining towns and his subsequent academic appointments, including leadership roles in earth sciences and mining engineering departments. Plimer describes himself as a polymath with a specialist knowledge of geology, having published hundreds of scientific papers and several books. Early in his career, he engaged with creationism debates, concluding that certain groups misuse science to promote religiously motivated but scientifically untenable claims. He later saw parallels between creationism and what he terms the religion of climate science, setting the stage for his critical stance toward mainstream climate narratives. Plimer controversially refers to climate science as the biggest cult in scientific history, arguing that it has little basis in validated scientific evidence and instead operates as a belief system with elements of faith, sin, and penance. He expresses concern over the vast financial costs stemming from climate policies that attempt to restructure energy systems based on fear of carbon dioxide emissions. According to Plimer, these costs run into trillions and are debilitating Western economies by promoting unreliable and expensive energy sources like wind and solar, dismissing the feasibility of running industrial societies on such intermittent power. He contends that science, by its nature, should be tentative and consistent with other validated knowledge, and he claims climate science fails this test, particularly when compared to geological data spanning hundreds of millions of years. A cornerstone of Plimer's argument is the geologic record demonstrating that Earth has experienced much higher levels of carbon dioxide, up to 10 to 20%, compared to today's 0.04%, during periods marked by massive ice ages rather than runaway warming. He explains that over the past 500 million years, atmospheric carbon dioxide has steadily decreased as it was sequestered into rocks such as carbonates and coals. During this long span, the Earth has undergone about 6 major ice ages, indicating a complex relationship between CO2 and temperature. Plimer argues that carbon dioxide does not drive global temperature extremes in any straightforward way, and notes that temperature changes have often preceded CO2 increases in ice core data by hundreds of years, reflecting natural oceanic processes rather than human activity. Plimer critiques the climate models underpinning much of mainstream climate science, stating that none of the 102 major models accurately predicted temperature trends over the last 40 years. He accuses climate modelers of making a fundamentally flawed assumption that carbon dioxide drives temperature. He challenges scientists to produce a single paper that definitively shows human emissions as the primary driver of global warming, claiming none exist. He also disputes the notion of scientific consensus, emphasizing that true science thrives on skepticism and revision, not majority opinion. He observes that many geologists and other scientists outside climate science fields remain skeptical, but that political and economic incentives have entrenched the dominant narrative. Plimer discusses how climate science has become entangled with politics and bureaucratic interests, leading to a situation where fear and funding drive research agendas. He recounts being on research councils where grants were directed toward climate change topics regardless of scientific merit. Government funding and institutional prestige favor climate narratives that emphasize catastrophic man-made impacts, which in turn sustains a global scientific bureaucracy. Politicians and administrators often lack the scientific understanding to critically assess climate claims, but rely on alarmist models to justify policies. Plimer considers this a dangerous politicization of science that undermines public trust not only in climate science, but potentially in other scientific fields like medicine. The discussion touches on the cultural phenomenon where climate change has replaced traditional religions for many in the West, tapping into human desires for faith and penitence amid declining adherence to Christianity. Plimer compares figures like Greta Thunberg to religious icons, noting skepticism about her scientific knowledge but recognizing her symbolic role. He also notes the societal impact of climate fear, including demographic effects, such as people choosing not to have children due to apocalyptic anxieties. The conversation highlights historical parallels, such as past generations living through war or famine, who nevertheless continued life, questioning the rationality of contemporary despair. Plimer stresses that humans tend to view climate from very short timescales, the last 50 years or so, which distorts perspectives. In contrast, geologists operate on millions to hundreds of millions of years, revealing complex cycles driven by plate tectonics, continental positions, solar variations, orbital changes, Milankovitch cycles, galactic factors, volcanic activity, and oceanic currents. He explains how tectonic processes release CO2 through mid-ocean ridges and volcanic activity, influencing long-term climate trends. The current climatic configuration, including polar ice and sea levels, is unusual in Earth's history. He argues that paleoclimate data contradict the narrative of unprecedented recent warming directly linked to CO2 emissions. Plimer promotes adaptation as the rational response to inevitable climate changes rather than attempting to prevent them. Humanity has historically adapted to colder or warmer periods through technological innovation, agriculture, societal changes, and trade. He cites medical studies showing more deaths result from cold weather than heat, illustrating the greater human vulnerability to cooling periods. Rather than economic suicide through costly net-zero policies, resources should be allocated toward resilience measures, such as flood defenses and infrastructure improvements, modeled after successful examples like the Netherlands. Slow geological and climatic changes allow societies time to plan and adapt. While not dismissing the concept of green technologies outright, Plimer argues that to date, none have proven more efficient or cost-effective than traditional energy sources. The global economy remains dependent on reliable, cheap energy, primarily coal, oil, and increasingly nuclear power. He highlights the inconsistency of Australia banning coal domestically while exporting it to China, where coal consumption continues to rise. The destruction of fertile land for renewable installations and the supply chain dependencies on countries like China further undermine purported environmental goals. In his view, the green transition being pushed in Western nations is disconnected from energy realities and economic necessities. Plimer points out that nuclear energy offers a stable, low-carbon energy source, praising countries like France and Slovenia for successfully relying on nuclear power. Opposition to nuclear often stems from Cold War fears and misinformation. Modern nuclear reactors use advanced safety designs that make disasters like Fukushima unlikely to be repeated. He advocates for a balanced energy mix, including nuclear, dismissing the shutdown of nuclear plants in some Western countries as politically motivated rather than grounded in energy needs. Ultimately, he sees nuclear power as essential in preventing energy crises, contrasting it with the limitations of wind and solar. He describes a shift beginning in the 1990s where the availability of large climate-related funding skewed scientific research priorities. Universities compete for grants by aligning with prevailing climate narratives, often discouraging dissenting views. This leads to a self-reinforcing establishment where challenging the orthodoxy risks career penalties. Many climate scientists are mathematical modelers with limited expertise in geology or paleontology, which hold important clues about past climate. This institutional capture, in Plimer's opinion, threatens the integrity of scientific inquiry and broader societal trust in expert knowledge. Beyond the science, Plimer expresses concern about the broader social fabric, emphasizing the erosion of Western cultural values and critical thinking skills. He links this decline to the abandonment of Christianity and the rise of uncritical ideological beliefs masquerading as science. The climate debate, in his view, exemplifies this trend, fostering fear and division rather than informed discussion. He calls for renewed emphasis on history, critical thinking, and understanding the scientific method to enrich society's future and avoid the pitfalls of ideological groupthink. Plimer acknowledges that his views have evolved in light of ongoing research and new data, emphasizing that scientific conclusions are provisional and subject to revision. He notes that some prominent figures previously advocating aggressive climate policies, such as Bill Gates, have moderated their positions, largely based on economic and practical considerations. He encourages open debate and skepticism in science and recognizes that the current scientific and political climate discourages such discourse. Ultimately, he urges society to focus less on unattainable climate control goals and more on practical adaptation strategies grounded in a comprehensive understanding of Earth's complex climate system.